You like that, do you?
Welcome to the tripod.
So hello and welcome to another tutorial on the tripod page, and this tutorial is going to focus on the exposure triangle. So we're going to jump into camera sim here. We're going to break down the three settings of the exposure triangle. The first being ISO, second being aperture, and the third being shutter speed. So as you can see here in camera sim, I have just switched to aperture priority. I have my three settings: ISO, aperture, and shutter speed. And then I have an exposure meter down here. And when the line is in the middle, that means I have a perfectly exposed image. So when I'm taking an image, I can choose my ISO, my aperture, or my shutter speed to set my exposure. Typically you choose one and change the other two, or choose two and change the other one. But there has to be a variable in there somewhere to balance your exposure. So for the first example, we're going to go through what ISO is. And ISO is basically how light sensitive your camera is to direct sunlight or the sun coming into the camera. So with an ISO of 100, we liken it to a really sallow skin where they can go out in the sun with no sun cream. They're going to get a lovely color. They're never going to burn. It's just going to produce a really nice tan, or in the case of ISO, a really nice image. Conversely, then you can go up to ISO 6400, and if you snap a picture, you can see there's a load of grain inside in a file that's shot at a high ISO. Versus when you drop it down to ISO 100, you can see there's very little grain. The next then on our list is aperture. And aperture is like the iris of your eye. So the wider the aperture, the more light comes in. It's the same with your eye. When it's dark, your eye or your pupil dilates and it lets a lot of light in. When it's really bright, it contracts right down and it doesn't let a lot of light in. The aperture works the exact same, and it's found in your lens. And the other property of the aperture is it controls your depth of field. So that's how much is in focus in your image. In this case, with the aperture, it's difficult to show you on this simulator the depth of field effect. But in terms of exposure, ISO, we know that we can double or half our ISO to achieve one stop, which you can see the stops here on the exposure meter. With aperture and shutter speed, it's 3 clicks will give you one stop of light. The next variable then is your shutter speed. So with shutter speed, you can see typically anything under 1/60th of a second is going to cause a blurry image. So you can see I was at 1/10 of a second there and I'm getting a blurry image. When you can ramp your shutter speed up over 1/60th of a second, you'll get a much crisper, sharper image. This is where a tripod comes into it though, because when you put a camera on a tripod, obviously it's going to be stationary. So if we put this camera on a tripod and I drop down my shutter speed to 1/10 again and snap, you can see that it's perfectly crisp and there's no motion blur in the picture. Now for shutter speed, the way that affects exposure, as Sean said in the podcast, if you open your fridge door for 1/10 of a second, you're not going to let much hot air into your fridge. Whereas if you open your fridge door for 1 second or 20 seconds, a lot of hot air is going to get into the fridge. In that analogy, the hot air is obviously the light and the fridge is your camera. It's a great little analogy from Sean there. So let's get into some proper examples. So when you have a scene like this in front of you, you can say to yourself, it's a landscape scene. I want lots of depth of field and a really clean image. By saying that, you've already decided two of the criteria for your exposure triangle. Your ISO is going to be 100 because you want a really clean image, and your aperture is going to be somewhere up around f11 or f16 because that we're going to be set off again now. Larger the number in aperture, the smaller the hole. The smaller the number, the bigger the hole. Aperture is just a really confusing one. But anyway, in this example, I've said I want a really clean and crisp image with a large depth of field. So ISO 100, f11. they're done, they're locked in from my statement. The last variable then is my shutter speed. So as you can see from the exposure meter, there's a little green arrow here pointing to the right of the +2, and that means that I'm really overexposed. So I need to bring my shutter speed in, and you can see now that this green line is on the exposure meter, and that's telling me that I'm one stop overexposed still. So just like on your camera's wheel, 3 little clicks, click, 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 is one stop of light. So you can see I've neutralized the exposure there now. So if I snap that image, you can see it's perfectly exposed. Now this is where the exposure triangle can be used to dictate the look of your image, because with these settings the way they are now, I could decide, okay, I want more grain in my image, so I'll put another stop or double the ISO from 100 to 200. That's another stop of light. In order to counteract that now, I need to take a stop away from another property. So in this case, I could take I could take 1, 2, 3 clicks off shutter speed, and that has balanced the exposure. Or I can go 1, 2, 3 clicks again, so I get a really fast shutter speed. And then to compensate for that and to let more light in, I need to go 1, 2, 3 off my aperture down to f8. And you can see I've completely different settings to last time now, but when I snap the picture, it looks the exact same exposure wise. If we were to change the scene again, say we were to get it at sunset here with the sun behind the hill, you can see now this is a really dark image, and my exposure meter has gone really dark. So when I'm looking at this, I'm thinking I really want to brighten this up, but I also want a large depth of field. So in that scenario, you would have no choice but to bring your ISO up to 6400, which is the max. F8 is okay, we'll take that, and the only variable then is my shutter speed, which has come down to 1/30th of a second. And this is where you can make the decision. You can snap your photo and decide, right, that's a really grainy image, and the f8 wasn't really enough depth of field. So you can decide, okay, I'm going to go 1, 2, 3 clicks for one more stop on aperture. So I need to increase my exposure by a stop again. So I'm going to go to shutter speed, 1, 2, 3 clicks, snap again. You can see the exposure is the exact same, but I increased the depth of field. And as I have this on a tripod or a virtual tripod, it doesn't affect the camera shake. So I can kind of sacrifice my shutter speed there. The other way that's handy now is ISO 6400. That's really grainy. So if I go 1 stop, 2 stops off the ISO, you can see we started at 64, half it to 32, half it to 1600, and that's 2 stops underexposed now. So I can go 6 clicks on my shutter speed or 6 clicks on my camera's wheel. 1, 2, 3, 1, 2, 3. And I'm back in the middle. I'm on my tripod, so being a quarter of a second doesn't really matter. Snap my photo and you can see, well, I hope you can see in this video, that there's less grain there. But as we're on a tripod, we can go again. We can take another stop away from the ISO and go 1, 2, 3 clicks on my shutter speed. And now we're at ISO 800, half a second, and still f11. And you can see the exposure meters in the middle again. Same picture, same exposure, but we've removed more grain. We'll just do that one final time. 1 click, half it down from 800 to 400 is 1 stop of light. So 1, 2, 3 clicks on my shutter speed brings us back to the middle exposure. Click again, and that's a clean image now at ISO 400. So that hopefully will show you that the exposure triangle has a weird numbered complex relationship, but it's as simple as a couple of clicks on your wheel, work in stops, double or half your ISO, double or half your shutter speed, and with aperture, just 3 clicks up or down, and that's 1 stop of light. So when you're deciding in your head, you make your statement about your scene, you know that if you want more depth of field, add onto your aperture by one stop, deduct it from something else. And it's that simple. Okay, hopefully you found that video helpful. Keep listening to the podcast, keep sending us the messages, keep giving us the feedback. We really appreciate it. I'm going to be linking to the cheat sheets we have on the exposure triangle down below if you're on YouTube, or probably in our bio on Instagram. If not, just send us a DM or jump into our Facebook group and we'll share them with you there. So thanks for watching again, and as always, stay safe.
Let's talk photography.